The dog had not slept anywhere but that pillow in over 2 years, not once. Not for a single night. And then, on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, he stood up in the middle of the night, walked to the foot of the bed, turned in a slow circle, and lay down facing the door. Margaret woke up at 3 a.m. because the mattress had shifted weight, and for one terrifying second, before her mind caught up with her heart, she thought Colonel had died right there beside her, the way Frank had. She reached out her hand in the dark, and instead of warm fur under Frank's old pillow, she found nothing but a cold, empty dent where a 70-pound shepherd mix had slept faithfully, night after night, for 730 nights in a row. She sat straight up in bed. She said his name into the darkness, soft and shaking. And when he lifted his head from the foot of the bed and looked at her, not with confusion, not with fear, but with something that looked almost like permission, Margaret Ellison, 68 years old, a widow for 2 years and 1 week, began to cry in a way she had not allowed herself to cry since the funeral. Have you ever had an animal understand your grief before you understood it yourself? Before you could even put a name to what you were feeling? Has a dog, a cat, a horse ever looked at you like they already knew the ending of a story you hadn't finished writing yet? Sit with that question for a moment, because that is exactly where this story begins, and it is exactly where, if you have ever loved an animal through the hardest season of your life, you are going to find yourself living inside every single word of what happens next. Margaret didn't move for a long time after that. She sat in the dark, in the house that used to be full of Frank's snoring and the creak of his knees on the stairs, and she stared at the empty space beside her where a dog had chosen, every night for 2 years, to be the thing that filled it. The furnace kicked on somewhere below her. The old house ticked and settled the way it always did after midnight, sounds she used to sleep straight through when Frank was alive to absorb them, back when a house full of another person's breathing made every strange noise feel small. Now every sound was a full sentence in a conversation she was having alone. She looked at Colonel, at the graying muzzle that had gone from black to silver faster than she liked to admit, and she whispered into the dark, "What do you know that I don't?" He didn't answer, of course. He just thumped his tail twice against the quilt, sighed the long, heavy sigh. He always sighed when he'd made a decision and wasn't going to explain it, and closed his eyes. And Margaret lay back down in a bed that suddenly felt bigger than it had in 2 years, and she did not sleep again until the sun came up. Frank Ellison had been the kind of man who fixed things before you knew they were broken. 31 years of marriage, and Margaret could count on one hand the number of times a leaky faucet or a squeaky hinge had lasted more than a day in that house before Frank got his hands on it. He was a quiet man, the kind who showed love in casseroles left warming in the oven and windshields scraped clean before Margaret ever stepped outside in the winter. He wasn't a man of big speeches. He was a man who remembered how she took her coffee even after 3 decades, who still opened her car door, who called her kiddo, even when they were both well past 60. When the cancer took him, it took him fast, faster than either of them was ready for, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral home, and Margaret spent most of those 6 weeks in a fog so thick she couldn't have told you what day of the week it was. It was Colonel who got her through the worst of it, even before Frank was gone. The dog had been Frank's idea in the first place, a rescue from the county shelter 8 years earlier, half German shepherd and half something nobody could quite identify, with one ear that stood straight up and one that flopped over like it had given up on the whole enterprise. Frank used to joke that Colonel looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts at the end of a long shift, and maybe that was true, but there was nothing halfway about the way that dog loved this family. In those last 6 weeks, when Frank could barely get out of the recliner, Colonel had positioned himself at Frank's feet for hours at a time, not moving, not whining, just present, the way only a dog seems to know how to be present, without needing anything back for it. The day Frank died, in the hospital room with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and Margaret's hand wrapped around his, Colonel was home alone, and when Margaret finally walked through the front door at 2 in the morning, hollowed out and unable to feel her own feet on the carpet, the dog met her at the door and did not bark, did not jump, did not do. He simply pressed his whole body against her legs and stayed there, silent, while she stood in the doorway and finally let the sound out of her chest that she'd been holding in since the doctor said the words she'd known were coming. That night, for the first time, Colonel did not sleep in his usual spot by the back door. He walked straight down the hallway, jumped up onto the bed Margaret hadn't been able to bring herself to climb into, and lay down on Frank's side, his head resting square in the middle of Frank's pillow, in the exact spot where a man's head had rested every night for 31 years. Margaret stood in the doorway of her own bedroom and watched him do it, and something in her chest cracked open a little wider, because it was the first time since the diagnosis that anyone, anything, had done something that felt like it understood the size of what she'd lost. In the weeks that followed, Margaret learned the particular architecture of grief, the way you learn a new town, one wrong turn at a time. She learned that Tuesdays were somehow worse than Mondays, because Tuesday had been Frank's day to take the trash cans to the curb, and every Tuesday morning her body still woke up expecting to hear him grumbling about the recycling lid. She learned that grief didn't move in a straight line, that some mornings she could pour her coffee and look out at the backyard and feel almost like herself. And other mornings, the smell of his aftershave still clinging faintly to his side of the closet could put her on the floor. And through all of it, every single day, Colonel was there. He started sleeping on Frank's pillow every night without fail, and during the day he took to lying in the exact spot on the living room rug where Frank's recliner used to leave its dent, even after Margaret finally gave the recliner away to her nephew. He would sit by her feet while she paid the bills at the kitchen table, the way he used to sit by Frank's feet in those last 6 weeks, as if he had simply transferred the job from one Ellison to the other without missing a step. When she cried, which was often in that first year, he would climb up beside her on the couch, a 70-pound dog trying to fit himself into her lap like a house cat, and press his head against her chest until her breathing slowed down to match the rhythm of his. Margaret's daughter, Susan, who lived 3 states away and called every Sunday evening like clockwork, used to say, only half joking, that Colonel was doing the grief work Margaret couldn't do for herself. "That dog is basically your therapist, Mom," Susan said once, and Margaret had laughed for the first time in weeks, because it was true, and because there was something both funny and unbearably sad about how right her daughter was. Colonel didn't have a framed degree on the wall. He didn't have a soothing voice or a box of tissues on the side table. What he had was an unwavering, uncomplicated loyalty that asked nothing of her except that she keep breathing, keep getting up in the morning, keep filling his food bowl and letting him out into the yard, and in exchange he gave her a reason to do all 3. The neighbors on Willow Creek Road got used to seeing them together on their evening walks. A small, silver-haired woman and a big dog with mismatched ears, moving slow past the mailboxes as the sun went down. Jim Castellano, who lived 2 houses down and had lost his own wife, Donna, to a stroke almost 4 years earlier, started waving from his porch most evenings around 6, and sometimes he'd walk down to the end of his driveway just to scratch Colonel behind the ears and ask Margaret how she was holding up. He never pushed. He never asked more than the question deserved. He was simply there, the way a good neighbor is there, offering nothing more complicated than a kind word and a familiar face at the end of a hard day, and Margaret came to look forward to those 5 minutes at the mailbox more than she ever would have admitted out loud, even to Susan. For 2 full years, Colonel's routine never changed. Frank's pillow at night, the dent in the rug during the day. a silent, steady presence anywhere Margaret's grief happened to land, and Margaret built her whole broken, healing life around the shape of that routine, without ever once stopping to wonder what it would mean if it changed. The trouble was, Margaret didn't want it to change. Somewhere in the second year, without ever saying it out loud, without even fully admitting it to herself in the quiet of her own mind, Margaret had decided that Colonel sleeping on Frank's pillow was the last thread connecting her to her husband, and she had quietly, fiercely, resolved to protect that thread with everything she had left. If the dog slept there, some small, stubborn part of her reasoned, then some small part of Frank was still in that bed too. It didn't matter that the logic didn't hold up under any real scrutiny. Grief doesn't ask for logic. Grief asks for anything solid enough to hold on to, and Margaret had built her entire nightly ritual, brushing her teeth, turning off the hallway light, saying goodnight to an empty pillow with a dog's head on it, around that one small sacred constant. So when Colonel got up that Tuesday night and walked to the foot of the bed, it didn't just startle her. It frightened her in a way she hadn't expected to be frightened by anything ever again. Because if the dog could stop, without warning, without permission, without so much as a moment's hesitation, after 730 nights of perfect consistency, then what did that mean about everything else Margaret had built her healing around? What did it mean about her own heart, which had spent 2 years insisting it was closed for good, that it had done its one great love story and didn't have another one left in it? She told herself it was nothing. Dogs change their sleeping spots sometimes, she reasoned the next morning over her coffee, watching Colonel eat his breakfast with the same unbothered enthusiasm he always had. Maybe his hips were bothering him. Maybe the pillow had gotten lumpy. Maybe it was simply August, and the nights were warmer, and he wanted to be closer to the window at the foot of the bed where a little more air moved through the screen. She made a list of reasonable explanations the way she used to make grocery lists, methodical and orderly, because an orderly list was easier to hold than the alternative, which was the creeping, uninvited feeling that something in her house, in her life, in the careful architecture of her grief, had shifted without her consent. But the second night, Colonel did it again, and the third. By the end of that week, it was simply where he slept now, at the foot of the bed, curled facing the bedroom door instead of facing Frank's pillow, as though he'd repositioned himself to watch for something, or someone, that hadn't arrived yet. Margaret found herself reaching over in the dark on the fourth night, running her hand across the empty pillow, and for the first time in 2 years it felt exactly like what it was. Empty, not sacred. Not full of some lingering trace of Frank that a dog's warmth had been keeping alive. Just an empty pillow on an empty side of a bed that had belonged to a man who had been gone for 2 years, and it was as if Colonel moving those 3 feet to the foot of the bed had finally, gently, let the last of the illusion fall away. She didn't cry that night, which surprised her more than anything. She lay very still in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 2 years, which was simply the size of the space around her. Not Frank's absence exactly. She had lived inside that absence for 2 years, and knew its every contour by heart, but her own presence inside it, alone, undiluted, with nothing between her and the truth of her own life, except a dog who had apparently decided, on some level she couldn't access or argue with, that it was time. The week that followed was, without question, one of the hardest of Margaret's entire 2 years of widowhood, and that included the funeral, that included the first Christmas without him, that included the day she finally boxed up his clothes for the church donation drive and sat on the closet. Because grief, it turned out, was easier to carry when it had a shape. For 2 years, Margaret's grief had lived in a specific, contained place, the left side of the bed, the recliner-shaped dent in the rug, the coffee mug with the chipped handle that only Frank ever used, and that Margaret still washed by hand, and put back in the same cabinet even though nobody drank from it anymore. As long as the grief stayed in its containers, Margaret could function around it, could build a life in the spaces between the reminders. But now the containers were opening up on their own, spilling into every corner of her days, and Margaret didn't know how to hold something that had lost its shape. She found herself standing in the kitchen at odd hours, holding Frank's chipped mug, turning it over in her hands, and asking herself questions she had spent 2 years avoiding. Was she actually healing, or was she just getting better at pretending the hole wasn't there? Had she built her whole life around a dog's loyalty because it was easier than facing her own? And underneath all of it, quieter and more frightening than any of the other questions, was one she could barely let herself think in full sentences. Was some part of her, some small, guilty, human part of her, actually a little relieved that the pillow was empty now, because an empty pillow meant there was room, and room meant possibility, and possibility felt like a betrayal of 31 years of marriage even to consider. She called Susan on a Wednesday night, earlier than their usual Sunday call, and she found herself crying on the phone in a way she hadn't since the week of the funeral. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she told her daughter, her voice cracking over the line. "The dog moved off Dad's pillow, and I feel like I lost him all over again." Susan was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that Margaret needed to hear and didn't want to hear in equal measure. "Mom, maybe Colonel didn't take something away from you. Maybe he's been holding a place for you this whole time, and now he thinks you're ready to hold it yourself." Margaret didn't sleep well that whole week. She'd lie awake watching Colonel at the foot of the bed, his silver muzzle tucked under one paw, his body angled toward the bedroom door in a way she still couldn't explain, and she'd whisper into the dark asking him what he knew, what he was waiting for, what had changed in that dog's heart or mind or whatever quiet animal instinct governed his choices, that made him decide, after 730 nights, that his job of holding Frank's place was finished. She didn't get an answer, of course. She never did. But somewhere in the middle of that hard, sleepless week, underneath the grief and the confusion and the fear of what an empty pillow might mean, a small, stubborn seed of curiosity started to grow in her, about what exactly was coming next, and whether she had the courage to let it. It was Jim who noticed first, actually, before Margaret had said a word to anyone but Susan. He'd been walking down to his mailbox on a Thursday evening, the same as always, and he'd caught Margaret and Colonel on their usual loop past his driveway, except, this time, something in the way Margaret was walking, a little slower, a little more hollowed out than usual, made him stop his own routine and walk out to meet her instead of waiting at the end of the driveway like he normally did. "You all right, Margaret?" he asked, and there was something in the plainness of the question, no pity in it, no performance, just a neighbor genuinely asking, that made her stop pretending she was fine. She told him, standing there on the sidewalk in the last orange light of the evening, about Colonel and the pillow, about the 2 years of routine that had ended without warning, about how strange and unmoored she'd felt ever since. She hadn't meant to tell him all of it. She certainly hadn't meant to tell him the part about feeling guilty for the strange, unfamiliar flicker of relief underneath the grief. But Jim had a way of listening that made a person forget they were only supposed to share the polished version of things, and by the time she finished, the streetlights had come on, and Colonel was sitting patiently at both their feet, looking back and forth between them like he was following the conversation. Jim didn't offer advice, which Margaret appreciated more than she could have said. He didn't tell her Frank would want her to be happy, the way well-meaning people sometimes did, phrases that were true but somehow never landed the way they were intended to. He just nodded slowly and said, "Donna's been gone almost 4 years now, and I still sleep on my side of the bed. Never could bring myself to move over, even after all this time. Guess we all hold on to our little rituals in our own way." Then he smiled, a little sadly, and added, "Maybe that dog's just further along than the two of us." That comment stayed with Margaret for days. She turned it over in her mind while she folded laundry, while she pulled weeds in the garden Frank used to tend every summer, while she lay awake at night watching Colonel sleep peacefully at the foot of the bed, as though nothing at all were troubling him, as though he'd simply made a decision and moved on with the easy confidence that only animals seem to possess. Humans complicated everything, she thought. Humans build stories on top of stories, meaning on top of meaning, until the simplest facts got buried under decades of second-guessing. A dog just knew when it was time to move, and moved. The following week brought its own strange test. Margaret's sister, visiting from Ohio for a long weekend, made an offhand comment over dinner about how nice it would be if Margaret found someone to keep her company in her later years, someone to travel with, someone to sit across the table from at breakfast. Margaret had bristled at the comment in a way that surprised even her, snapping back that she didn't need anyone, that she had 31 years with the only man she'd ever wanted, and that was enough for one lifetime. Her sister had gone quiet, chastened, and the rest of the dinner passed in an uncomfortable politeness that neither of them fully recovered from before her sister left on Sunday morning. But that night, alone again, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed with Colonel's head resting on her knee, and she asked herself honestly, for the first time, whether her anger at dinner had really been about Frank, or whether it had been about fear. Fear of what it might mean to let someone else matter. Fear of what 31 years of marriage was worth if she let something new grow in the space it left behind. Fear, most of all, that Colonel's decision to leave that pillow meant her own heart had already started moving in a direction her mind hadn't given permission for, and some part of her, the part that had snapped at her sister over the dinner table, was furious at being left behind by her own dog's instincts. The knock on the door came on a Saturday morning, exactly 8 days after Colonel first moved to the foot of the bed, and Margaret would think back on that timing for years afterward, the way it lined up so precisely that it felt less like coincidence and more like something had been quietly arranging itself all along. She was in the kitchen in her housecoat, hair still down from sleep, when Colonel's ears went up and he trotted to the front door before the second knock even landed, his tail wagging in the particular rhythm he reserved for people he already loved, not the cautious, measured wag he gave strangers, but the full, unrestrained sweep that meant this was someone whose scent he already knew by heart. Margaret opened the door in her housecoat, unprepared, her hair uncombed, and found Jim Castellano standing on her porch holding a pie, an apple pie by the smell of it, still warm enough that she could see the faint coo. But it wasn't the pie that stopped her breath in her chest, it was his face. Jim Castellano, 70 years old, a man who had run his own hardware store for 35 years and never once, in all the times she'd talked to him at the mailbox, seemed anything less than steady, was standing on her porch looking more nervous than any grown man she had ever seen in her life. His hands were shaking slightly around the pie plate. He'd shaved that morning, closely, the way a man shaves when he's trying to make an impression, and there was a small piece of tissue paper still stuck to his jaw where he'd nicked himself in his hurry. "I made too much pie," he said, and the lie was so obvious, so tender in its obviousness, that Margaret felt something in her chest crack open for the second time in 8 days, except this crack didn't feel like grief. It felt like something else entirely. Something she hadn't let herself feel in so long she almost didn't recognize it. "Donna's old recipe," Jim went on, talking faster than usual, the words tumbling out ahead of his nerve. "I don't rightly know what to do with a whole pie by myself, and I thought maybe you and Colonel might want to share it with me, if you're not busy. If it's not too forward. I know it's early, and I probably should have called first, but I was up baking at 6, and I didn't want to lose my nerve by the time it was a decent hour to call. Margaret stood in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, and looked down at Colonel, who had planted himself directly between the two of them, tail sweeping the porch floorboards, looking up at Jim, and then up at Margaret with an expression she could only describe as expectant, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment for 8 days, as though he had known it was coming before either of the two humans standing there had a single clue. And that was when it hit her, standing there in the doorway with the smell of warm apple pie drifting up from Jim's shaking hands, that Colonel hadn't left Frank's pillow because he'd forgotten Frank, or because 2 years was simply a long enough time for a dog's memory to fade. He'd left it because somewhere in that steady, silent animal instinct of his, he had sensed something arriving on the horizon of their lives days before either Jim or Margaret had worked up the courage to admit it to themselves, and he had quietly, gently, made room for it. "Would you like to come in, Jim?" Margaret heard herself say, and the words surprised her almost as much as they seemed to surprise him. His shoulders, which had been drawn up near his ears with nerves, dropped an inch, and something like relief washed across his face so plainly that Margaret nearly laughed, the first real laugh she'd felt building in her chest in longer than she wanted to admit. "I'll put the coffee on," she said, stepping back to let him through the door, and Colonel trotted ahead of both of them into the kitchen, as though he'd been the one who'd invited Jim in the first place, as though this had always been the plan, and the two humans were simply the last to catch up. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had spent so many mornings alone with Frank's chipped mug, and for a moment the weight of that history pressed down on her chest so hard she thought she might have to excuse herself. But then Jim reached down without thinking and scratched Colonel behind his floppy ear, the way he always did at the mailbox, and Colonel leaned his whole considerable weight against Jim's leg with a contentment that broke something loose in Margaret's chest. Not a breaking of loss this time, but a breaking open, the kind that lets light into a room that's been dark for a long time. She cut 2 slices of pie with hands that weren't quite steady, and she thought about Frank. She let herself think about him fully and completely for the first time in weeks, without flinching away from the thought, and she found, to her own surprise, that thinking of him didn't feel like betraying and it felt like carrying him forward into a room he would have wanted her to be sitting in. Jim talked about Donna a little, carefully at first, the way people talk about grief with someone who understands its exact shape, and Margaret talked about Frank the same way, and somewhere in the unhurried back and forth of two people who had each spent years learning how to carry an enormous loss, the nervousness between them eased into something gentler, something that felt less like a first date and more like two old friends finally admitting they'd been dancing around each other's kitchens for longer than either wanted to say out loud. Colonel settled himself under the table between their feet, his silver muzzle resting on his paws, his tail giving one long, satisfied thump against the floor every so often, as if he were keeping time with a rhythm only he could hear. It was somewhere around the second cup of coffee that Margaret told Jim about the pillow, about the 2 years of Colonel sleeping on Frank's side, about the night 8 days earlier when everything had changed without warning. Jim listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without rushing to fill the silence, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "You know, Donna always used to say animals know things about our hearts before we're brave enough to know them ourselves. I never really believed her until just now." Margaret felt tears come to her eyes, but they were different tears than the ones she'd cried for 2 years, lighter somehow, tears that didn't have grief sitting underneath them, so much as something that felt impossibly, dangerously like hope. Jim stayed for 2 hours that morning, far longer than either of them had planned, and by the time he stood up to leave, apologizing again for showing up unannounced with a pie and a nervous excuse, something had shifted permanently in Margaret's kitchen, something that had nothing to do with furniture or fresh paint, and everything to do with the way a house starts to feel different once laughter has been let back into it. At the door, Jim hesitated, turning his hat over in his hands. the way men of his generation did when they were working up to something, and he finally asked if she might like to have dinner with him that Friday. Nothing fancy. Margaret said yes before she'd even fully decided to say it, the word simply arriving on its own, easy and certain in a way that surprised her more than anything else that whole strange, wonderful morning had. That Friday dinner became a Tuesday coffee, which became a Sunday afternoon walk with Colonel trotting between them like a chaperone who had appointed himself to the job. And over the following months, slowly, without any of the urgency or drama that young love seems to demand, something steady and warm grew between Margaret and Jim, built not on the idea of replacing what either of them had lost, but on the shared, hard-earned understanding of two people. Neither of them ever pretended the other was a replacement for what came before. Frank's chipped mug still sat in its cabinet. Donna's apple pie recipe, handwritten on an index card gone soft at the corners, still had a place of honor in Jim's kitchen drawer. But there was room now, it turned out, for both the honoring of what had been and the building of something new. And Margaret found that the two didn't compete with each other the way she had feared they would. They simply coexisted, the way grief and love had always, somehow, found a way to coexist inside every human heart big enough to hold them both. And through all of it, Colonel never went back to Frank's pillow again. He stayed at the foot of the bed, faithful and steady, until the evening about a year later when Jim, cautiously, almost shyly, started staying over on weekends, and Colonel simply shifted his spot once more, this time to a folded blanket on the floor beside the bed, as if he understood, better than either of the two humans in that room, that his job had never really been about which pillow he slept on. His job had always been about making sure Margaret was never alone with her pain longer than she needed to be. And once he'd made sure of that, once he'd watched the two people he loved most in the world find their way to warm apple pie and second chances, Margaret thinks about that Tuesday night often, the night she woke up in a panic to find an empty pillow beside her, certain for one terrible second that she had lost everything all over again. She understands now, years later, that she had that night completely backwards. She hadn't lost anything at all. She had, without knowing it, been given the quietest, gentlest gift. A grieving heart can receive, an animal patient enough to hold a place for her for exactly as long as she needed it held, and wise enough, in whatever wordless way animals carry their wisdom, to know the precise moment when holding it any longer would have stopped being love and started being a cage. Colonel never explained himself. He never needed to. He simply did what the best of them do, which is love without conditions, and without needing credit for the loving, and trust that the people around him would catch up to what he already understood in his own time. There is a particular kind of faith that animals carry, one that doesn't announce itself with words or sermons, but shows up instead in small physical acts of devotion, a warm body pressed against your legs in a doorway on the worst night of your life, a head resting patiently on a pillow that isn't his own, a quiet shift to the foot of the bed on a Tuesday that changes the whole direction. Margaret isn't a particularly religious woman, never has been, but she has come to believe, in the years since that pie showed up on her porch, that some gifts arrive disguised as grief, and some grief, if you're patient enough and brave enough to sit inside it instead of running from it, eventually reveals itself to have been carrying you toward something all along. She thinks Frank would have liked Jim. She thinks Frank, who spent 31 years fixing things before she knew they were broken, would have been quietly, deeply grateful to a dog with mismatched ears who managed, in his own way, to fix the one thing Frank could no longer be there to fix himself, which was the unbearable size of the silence he left behind. Colonel is older now, gray around the muzzle, in a way that makes Margaret's chest tighten every time she notices it, slower on the stairs, content these days to sleep most of the afternoon in a patch of sunlight on the living room floor, while Margaret and Jim putter around the house they've slowly, gently made into a But some nights, when the house is quiet and Jim's breathing has settled into the slow rhythm of sleep beside her, Margaret still reaches down in the dark to rest her hand on Colonel's head, where he sleeps on his blanket by the bed, and she still whispers the same words she whispered to him on that terrifying, transformative Tuesday night 2 years into her widowhood. Thank you for knowing before I did. So here's what I want to ask you, because I have a feeling some of you watching this already know exactly what I mean. Has an animal in your life ever seemed to understand your grief, or your loneliness, or the exact shape of what you needed before you understood it yourself? And if you've ever had a pet who seemed to sense a change coming in your life before it arrived, the way Colonel did on that Tuesday night, I want you to tell me about it in the comments below, because I read every single one, and I promise you, stories like these deserve to be told out loud, not kept quiet in the corners of our own hearts. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you of your own dog, your own cat, your own horse, your own quiet animal companion who somehow always seemed to know more about your heart than you gave them credit for, do me a favor and hit that like button before you scroll away, because it helps stories like Margaret and Colonel's find their way to the people. And if you love these kinds of human and animal bond stories, hit that subscribe button, because every single week we bring you a brand new story just like this one, real, raw, and guaranteed to touch your heart. Thank you for sitting with us through this one. We'll see you in the next story.